Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path. And what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. On today's show, we have special guest, a dear friend of ours, Jill Blakeway. Jill is the founder and director of the Yin-Ova Center in New York City and the author of several books, her most recent being Energy Medicine. Jill is the host of CBS Radio's popular weekly podcast, Grow, Cook, Heal, which I have had the honor of being a guest on, a teacher of gynecology and obstetrics at the doctoral program at Pacific College of Oriental Medicine, and a renowned authority on alternative medicine and women's health. For more information on Jill Blakeway, please visit yinovacenter.com, and we'll have that on our resource page. In today's episode with Jill, we discuss her new book, Energy Medicine. Together, we touch on so much, I can't even list it here. But just to highlight a few, teachings from Neale Donald Walsh on manifestation and choosing love versus fear, proven healings that can happen through energy fields, how interconnected we all are and the research that proves it, how an energized cell medium was found to change cancer markers in cells, and so much more. This conversation is fun and full of research and interesting facts on the existence of energy, so we're really excited to share it with you. If you've been enjoying the show, there are a few ways you can help support us. We would love it if you leave a review on iTunes. This helps more people find the show, and it feels great to us. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to receive our weekly digest, or find out more about becoming one of our precious supporting members on Patreon. We've chosen not to have advertisers on the show at this time, which means that this is the way to support us. If these episodes have helped uplift your world, we hope you'll go over and check out making a Patreon donation. Brooke and I also do see clients privately, so feel free to go to the website for more information on that. One thing before we head into the conversation, on occasion Brooke and I curse. I don't think we did in this episode, but if you are in mixed non-swearing company, you may want to pop in some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go. Ladies, and hi, Brooke.
Hey, Vanessa.
And we're so excited to introduce all of you to our friend and our colleague, Jill Blakeway.
Vanessa and Brooke, hello. Thank you for having me on your show.
So for all of you listening, we actually know Jill a while now. Gosh, Jill, I must know you. Well, how old is Emma? Probably 15 years or something like that.
Yes, well, she's 28, so I suspect we've actually known each other for 20 years. Amazing.
Wow. God, I can't believe how much time's gone by. And I know Jill from New York City from my days when I was a Chinese medicine doctor, in case any of you didn't actually know that about me. Jill is an amazing Chinese medicine doctor, and she owns a beautiful and fabulous wellness center, well, actually multiple now in New York City, called Yin-Ova. So what's great is Jill just put out a new book. Jill's authored several books, and the book is called Energy Medicine. And this is a book I remember Jill talking about, for years before it came out. And And you know what's funny? You know what I remember about our conversation, Jill, was the two of us saying that we always believed in energy, but that we felt somewhat safer having the label of acupuncturist because it was more respected culturally. It stood for thousands of years of empirical science in China. And there was research behind it, even by the time you and I were both practicing it. So this is a wonderful book because it's your journey with exploring what is energy and what is energy medicine. And I remember way back when we were having conversations about this. So we thought it would be fun to just start with the personal side of what prompted you to want to write a book like this and to go on this adventure.
Well, you're right, Vanessa. And this is my third book. And my first one particularly, I wrote with a doctor, and I looked very much at the medical and physiological effects of acupuncture. And I think acupuncturists have done that and leaned into that in order to explain acupuncture to the medical community and, Chinese medicine in general. And I was one of those. And but I always knew that something else was going on. And I started to explore that. It started to come through me in some ways. And then, because I'm me and I like to know how things work, I wanted to understand the science behind that, the energetic connection I had with my patients. So HarperCollins very kindly commissioned me to go on this journey. And I went, as you know, because you've read the book, halfway around the world, talking to scientists and healers and asking them, what is this energetic connection? What are the prompts that prompt the body's intelligence to self-heal? And that's really what I looked at in the book. I looked at everything from acupuncture, which I think is an energetic and physical prompt, to placebo, which is more of a suggestion as a prompt. And I looked at the ways we connect and the ways we can affect each other in order to heal.
Yeah, you did bring a scientific exploration to it, but you can also tell in it you are an energy practitioner, right? And so you're on this personal journey. And I like that you phrased it as kind of going from Newtonian medicine to quantum medicine. And, what would the world be like if our doctors started to understand that we weren't just matter, that we were energy, that everything was energy?
Well, I started by exploring the relationship between energy and matter. And I realized that you and I went to Chinese medicine school together. We went to grad school together. And at Chinese medical school, people have a sort of tension going on between learning Western medicine, which we do in order to be licensed practitioners and be part of the medical system, and learning this very ancient system of medicine, acupuncture and Chinese medicine, which is the only form of licensed energy medicine in this country. And it's often very hard when you're studying it. And the tension, I think, is that tension between energy and matter. And scientists have been exploring that relationship for as long as scientists have been exploring science. And so I started to look at questions like, are we, like everything else in the universe, simply energy condensed? And if we are, do we operate by statistical laws, or are we operating under energetic laws like other things in the universe? And if we are, what does that mean? And as you know, I sort of weave in memoir along with the science and the mystery and the questions and the philosophy, because you're absolutely right, I am an energy worker, and I was sort of hiding it for many years. And in the book, I tell a story about a patient called Andrew, who had been my patient for many years just for things like back pain and routine conditions, and then was diagnosed with cancer and didn't want to do the Western treatment. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And I am not the kind of practitioner who is massively alternative. I like to integrate. I like people to get the best of all possible worlds. And so I was very reticent to treat him. But we talked to his doctors, and prostate cancer is very slow growing. And they said, he had 3 months before they would start conventional treatment. And I think that was the beginning of me allowing the energy to come through me, because I very much wanted to help him. And I just opened up and I could feel fizzing down my spine. And I treated him for 3 months. He also worked on himself. So this was a very collaborative healing arrangement. And at the end of 3 months, the prostate cancer was gone. And that was about 15 years ago. And I checked in on him before I wrote the book, and it never came back. So that, I think, was the beginning of me understanding that I could create healing connections with people that were in some ways reciprocal. He changed his diet. He showed up. He changed his relationship to God. He changed his relationships with his family. There were many aspects of this that were very hard to disentangle. But I certainly started to do a much more energetic form of acupuncture. And the result was a happy one for both of us. And it set me on this journey in some ways, because then I wanted to know, well, how did he heal? How did he reverse his cancer? Is that possible? And if so, is it replicable?
Yeah. And the journey, you know, for those who haven't read the book yet, it really comes through as this, you know, wonderful, almost hero's journey. You know, you're really deeply tracking this from multiple perspectives, and you're meeting these amazing people and having these wonderful experiences. And so I'm curious, you know, if working with your patient, Andrew, was the beginning of opening this door for yourself, and then you had this amazing adventure and lived inquiry that's chronicled in the book, and you're in practice, you know, how has that changed things for you on the other side of doing that? What do things look like in your practice, but also how has it impacted you personally? Because you know, when you dove in there, you experienced some really amazing things. It was life-changing to read about it. I'm sure to experience it firsthand was quite something.
Well, the journey itself was life-changing, and then writing about it and thinking about it was life-changing again, actually. But yes, I slowly went on this journey, and I realized when I was writing it that it was a pretty classic shamanic journey. You know, if you look at the shamanic journeys that people go through, they don't necessarily look pretty, and they're not always comfortable. And I write in the book about, you know, getting lost at points, and I tried to own my own, you know, failings and my own confusion. I very much wanted to stress to people that I wasn't particularly special. I don't believe I'm particularly special at all. I mean, we're all unique, but we're all curiously similar too. And I wanted to be clear that if I can do this, anyone can do this. This is accessible to all of us. And I went, you know, I fell down and had to pick myself up again. In the book, I was mentored for a while through some business problems by Neale Donald Walsh, and I talk about that mentorship and what that meant to me and how I grew. But really, how this has impacted me in the end is that by the time I finished writing this book, I was absolutely clear that there is an energy that is bigger than all of us that has intelligence, and you can call it God, you can call it whatever you want, actually, or source, but there is, and it's the same energy that runs through all of us. And because of that, we are all connected. And at that level, we are all one. We are all the same thing. And we individuate, and we come here, I believe, to experience duality. And then we do, and we don't like it very much. and we complain a lot, I do, about the dark and the light. But that's really why we're here, to experience ourselves in a dualistic world, I think. But that oneness, that connection can be used to transmit information. And I became clear about that. And it impacted the way I am with everybody, including myself. So that, yeah, you're right. It was very, very life-changing. And people who read it tell me it's life-changing to read, because I did actually take you with me. Yeah. And I was honest about the places where I fell over and had to pick myself back up.
Yeah. And it's also sorry. I was just going to say, it's also not magical thinking. You know, the way that you write the book brings you into it no matter your point of view, because you're really demonstrating, without erring on the side of being too data point driven, right? But you're really showing the tangibility of this, the reality of this. So it starts to flip the way that you show up in life and the way you feel about life, because it's like, oh, that's really tangible. As you were saying, it's something that is a part of human potential. It's not about those of us who are especially touched in some way or things like that. So I really appreciated that very much.
Well, in the book, one of the things that really affected me was impacted my understanding of how we connect was some studies at Princeton University. And I don't know if you remember that section, but they're back in the 1970s in the engineering department at Princeton, which is literally the least woo department at Princeton, I imagine. Don't you? They had a female grad student who wondered if she could create a machine that could be moved by the human mind. And I talked to Dr. Jean, who was the dean of engineering at Princeton at the time. He's since died. He was elderly when I talked to him. He was in his 90s. But he didn't for a moment, I think that she could actually design this machine. But he thought it would be an interesting grad school project to go through the motions of how would you set about designing a machine that could be moved by the human mind. And she did. She accomplished it. And she designed something they call a random event generator. And what it is, how it works is less interesting in some ways, but thanks to decaying atomic material, it spits out random numbers. And when we focus on it, particularly if more than one person focuses on it with intense feeling, the numbers become less random. And to give you an example that was really stunning to me, on September the 11th, by then they had random event generators all over the world at universities spitting numbers back to Princeton so they could check to see what happened, everywhere. And on September the 11th, they all started to become less random all across the earth. And about 4 hours before the planes hit the Twin Towers, which speaks in some ways to the fact that time isn't completely linear, I think. It also speaks to the fact that the events that unfolded here in New York and in Washington were already in motion 4 hours beforehand, if you see what I mean. Those people had already set off on those journeys, and they all started to come into sync. And that gives me goosebumps when I think about it. And they stayed as less random for the rest of that day. So after that, they produced little portable random event generators. And this research continues, not at Princeton anymore. It's done by the Global Consciousness Project. But they put them everywhere, the Trump inaugural, yoga retreats, churches, all sorts of things. And what they found is that love and compassion are very powerful connectors. And when we focus with love and compassion, the machines start to become less random again in a way that's statistically impossible. But unfortunately, fear also connects. And when we connect through fear, we also change the machine. And if you think about it, if we change the machine, we're also changing reality. We're changing physicality. It's energy affecting matter again. So we're changing our world. And as you know, love is a very expansive energy, very inclusive, very open. Fear is a very closed, restricting energy. And that was a big lesson for me, that we have to be careful not to get into fear. And we're seeing it. We're seeing in my own country, Britain, and we're seeing here in America, we're seeing at a national level fear contract our country's impact on the world stage. Britain, as it gets so fearful around Brexit, has become a smaller player on the world stage. America, as it withdraws from all sorts of agreements, has become a smaller player on the world stage, and that's due to fear and cruelty and all the things that go along with fear, anger and contempt and those kinds of emotions. And so I think those Princeton studies are actually really important, because they show us that we can change matter with intense emotions and directed thought, particularly when we gather in groups. So we need to be picking love. It's really that simple. We need to be picking love, because we're actually changing life as it unfolds if we don't.
Yeah.
I was telling Brooke earlier that I remember you once saying, I think I asked you if you could have a stage to talk about anything, what would it be? And I don't know if you remember this, Jill, but you said oneness.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I love that that's where you went right now. And that's a lot of what your book was bringing through. And what you just said about choosing love instead of fear, of course, to us makes absolute sense. I'm sure everyone listening that makes sense to. But we also know that tricky part about bypassing, about having fear running the undercurrent, and then attempting to manufacture a state of love above it. And you brought in some really good information from Neale Donald Walsh and others about the sponsoring thought or the belief systems underneath the conscious mind. And I wonder if you could share with us how you came to see that, because I know you wouldn't be a fan of a bypass. That's not in your nature. How does someone reconcile when deep inside they are still running thoughts and programs that are fueled by the energy of fear, but they want to become a conscious contributor of love?
Well, we all get fearful and we all get anxious. I get fearful. I get anxious. I think everybody does. My patients do. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just us experiencing duality, which makes us anxious. Me too. But I do think that you have to ask yourself a question when you're making decisions, love or fear. And in the book, I tell you that Neale made me wear a rubber band on my wrist and ping it and ask myself, love or fear. And so I ask myself really regularly, particularly business decisions, which often don't come as easily as healing decisions to me. What would love do? And love doesn't necessarily look mushy. Love isn't necessarily enabling. Love sometimes fires someone. And, love sometimes takes some tough decisions. But you can ask yourself, what would love do in this situation? Love would be humane. Love would be kind. Love would be lots of, expansive things. And you can feel the difference between a contraction and an expansion in your body, in fact. So I think it's just asking yourself, am I choosing love or fear? And then forgiving yourself, because loving yourself is a big part of this, because you will not choose love all the time, I don't think. I mean, I'm sure there are some very saintly people out there, but I don't choose love all the time. I stumble, I get reactive, I get angry, I'm still on my journey. So, but you can course correct. It's like, a plane doesn't fly to a destination in a straight line. Pilots are constantly course correcting. And I think it's the same with our lives. As we pilot our lives, we just have to constantly get back on, get course correct as we head to our destination.
Yeah. Vanessa brought this up, but I was wondering if we could go a little more into the sponsoring thought, because I thought it was such a great way to expose what are those little hidden fear nuggets underneath the actions that we're taking. And in the book, you also talked about some remarkable people. I'm thinking of the young man Anziani, who had healed his own spinal injury.
Yes.
And you sort of linked that to the Neale Donald Walsh sponsoring thought talk and said that it sounds like many things that was remarkable about Anziani is that he was self-healing and that he was free from sponsoring thoughts. So I feel like maybe we can understand what a sponsoring thought is and how to work with them a little more through this example of somebody who was free of sponsoring thoughts, like that you're actually able to accomplish remarkable things if those are not running the show, so to speak.
Well, Neale brought it up in the book when I interviewed him, which I did for this book. I included some of my time when he mentored me and some I did an interview with him. And he was talking about it in the context of manifestation in some ways, that a lot of the manifestation techniques have a sponsoring thought based on lack, and that's why they don't work. You know, if you want something, what you're putting out into the universe is the wanting. That's the sponsoring thought, not the accomplishing. Yeah. And so he suggested being grateful in advance as a way of creating your next, what he calls greatest and grandest version of yourself, which I always like. We're all works in progress. I often talk to my patients about creating the next greatest and grandest version of ourselves and stepping into it. And so he was warning against the sort of limiting sponsoring thought. And you're right, Madhu Anziani, I talk about him later in the book in a chapter called You the Healer, because his story is a story of self-healing. But the reason I like it is he didn't self-heal in a vacuum. He had a lot of help. He had doctors and other medical professionals. And so it was a really good collaborative story of healing. And what happened to Madhu is that he fell out of a window when he was in college, a second floor window, and he broke his neck. And his spinal cord was 99% severed. He was in a coma for, I think it was about a month. And when he woke up, he was told that he would be tetraplegic, that he would never walk again, and that he would be paralyzed from the neck down. And Madhu said to me, I'm paraphrasing a little, I quoted him directly in the book, but he said, I wasn't stupid, Jill. I knew that in all probability, I would spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair, but I just never let that permeate my being in any significant way. And he was 23 at the time, and it struck me that that's extraordinarily wise for someone of 23 to be able to do that. And he also said, I focused on joy. And I thought of Madhu lying in his hospital bed, paralyzed from the neck down, focusing on joy and not letting any negative idea of his future permeate him, and staying present in his present moment and in his joy, and even feeling bliss. And I thought that was remarkable, particularly in someone so young, but extraordinary. And Madhu started to make sounds. And as you know, when someone has a spinal cord injury of that type, their diaphragm doesn't work particularly well. So making sounds takes effort. And he felt the vibration from those sounds throughout his body. And he had the presence of mind and common sense to realize, if I can feel this vibration, I have some central nervous system left, or I wouldn't be able to feel vibration. So he started to make more and more sounds, and people taught him tones and mantras. And in the book, I talk about how different mantras affect different parts of your brain and your body. Someone brought a Tibetan prayer wheel into the hospital, and his father used to lift him up, and he would and help him move his hand to move the prayer wheel, and he would say his mantras and feel them throughout his body and have an experience of wholeness because of them. And at some point, a nurse, quite well-meaningly, I think, told him, you have to stop this, Madhu. You have to focus on being the best tetraplegic you can be, instead of thinking that you're going to walk. And he told her, I'm going to walk out of here. And 3 months after his accident, he did. And he told me a year later, he was well enough to get on a plane on his own to go and see his family in New York City. He was based in San Francisco. And what I like about that story is that Madhu's sponsoring thought was one of joy and bliss in one of the most appallingly horrible situations imaginable. He was deeply empowered to heal himself. And he used vibration, which was the only thing he had at his disposal to do it. But that wasn't all of it. You know, he was at UCSF, which has one of the best neurology departments in the world. He had phenomenal surgeons. He had physical therapy. He had occupational therapy. So he had input from other people. It was collaborative, like all the best healings are. But he was able to walk again. And he is now a sound healer, which makes sense, doesn't it? And I'm sure he's an excellent one. And so I told his story as one of the best examples of self-healing that I had heard, because it encapsulated both his state of mind as well as his use of vibration, I think.
Right, which are two different things you focus on. It's funny, my husband was paralyzed with Guillain-Barré syndrome. And the same thing, they told him, well, the first 24 hours you may die. And then after that, the odds of you walking are very low. And he never believed it. And he did go on to walk. He's actually just fine. Now, of course, so many things go into a moment like that. We can't oversimplify it. But I think all of us have experienced the power of belief within ourselves. If we're honest, I think we can see how powerful belief is. And I like the way you interplay that with vibration, because words and thoughts are vibrations. I think, you probably said that explicitly, and certainly implicitly. You wrote one place, I have a quote from you. I've come to believe that specific vibrations, whether from light or sound, make up the information that is transferred from one person to another in energy healing. And I would agree with you. And I thought it would be nice to share a little bit more about this resonance, because resonance was a pretty big theme in the book, and how we're affecting one another directly through our state of being, our vibration.
Well, my first exploration into resonance came when I met a professor at City University, Dr. Bill Bankston. He wrote an excellent book called The Energy Cure, and Bill's story is a curious one in many ways. He came upon an energy healing technique, which he learned from a psychic healer, and he decided to take it into the lab and test it. And what he did was he got mice that are specially bred to have cancer, and poor mice, but these mice die reliably on day 27. They're bred to do that. And that's how pharmaceuticals are tested. If you have a pharmaceutical that keeps the mouse alive for 35 days or something like that, then you've got a winner, kind of thing. So Bill got these mice that were bred to have cancer, and they gave them mammary cancer, breast cancer. And the first experiment he did himself, and he did the technique, and the mice got a lot worse to start with, and then healed themselves. They recovered from the cancer completely, which is unheard of. That isn't what pharmaceuticals do in the lab. They extend the life of the mice a bit, but these mice reversed their own cancer. And what's more, when they when they introduced cancer again, when they injected the cancer back into the mice, they couldn't get it. Their immune systems had been permanently changed. So Bill did what any good scientist would do, which is science has to be replicable to be useful. There's no point in studying a special someone somewhere who nobody else can see. Science needs to build on itself. So he took a group of students, skeptical students. He taught them the technique. He gave each of them 6 mice that were injected with the cancer, and he let them do it over a course of, I think it was 6 weeks. And they had the same results. All of their mice, no matter how skeptical they were, recovered and could not get the cancer anymore. And what Bill believes, and you can actually prove this, I think now, or we're well on our way to proving it, is that the technique he teaches, which I give in the book, he was very generous about letting me write about his technique. And it's hard to practice, but it's simple to learn. The technique he teaches distracts the ego and makes the healer into something of a conductor, and then information is passed on a frequency, which is so interesting. And that is called a resonant bond. Mm-hmm. And what that did, as you know, in the book, I started to wonder, well, I wonder what I'm doing with my patients, because I'm not doing what Bill's doing. But my patients also get better, not quite as miraculously as the mice, to be honest. But so I had an EEG of my brain and an EKG of my heart. And what I found was that my heart and my brain go into resonance with each other. They go at the same frequency. And to do that, I have to slow my brain down quite a bit. And then the patient's heart goes into resonance with mine. which is kind of beautiful, actually. That's love, isn't it? That connection of hearts. And it feels good. It feels good to the patient. It feels good to me. It feels like love. It feels like very, very pure love, not the pulley kind of romantic love or sexual love, but just a very pure version of love to me as well as the patient. And at that point, I believe the magic happens and information gets passed from one person to another. Bill calls it information rather than energy, because energy technically dissipates over a distance, and this doesn't seem to. And to give you a little addition to Bill's experiments, he realized he could put the frequency, the information, into water or liquid, and they put it into cell medium. And then they put human cancerous tissue into the cell medium. And when I wrote my book, it had made 9 genetic changes to the human cancerous tissue. It was, again, breast cancer. And by the time my book came out, Bill came to my book launch, it had made 67 genetic changes. And those experiments were done at Brown University.
And that's essentially like blessed water. It's charged water.
It is. And Bill can put it into cotton. He can put it into all sorts of things, and they can measure it. But it all starts with a bond, a resonant bond between a healer and a healee. And in the book, as you know, I start to look at all forms of these resonant bonds. There is a study at the that took place at the University of Connecticut, where they put 2 people in different MRIs, and when one thought healing thoughts about another, their brainwaves synced. Which I think is that feeling you have when you think of someone and then they text you, which happens the whole time. So we are in silent collaboration with each other, is what I realized. And those Princeton studies started me thinking that, with the random event generators. And Bill's studies made me realize that we are deeply affecting each other. There are also studies that show that when one person is interviewing another, the other person's heart waves start to show up in the interviewer's brainwaves, which is interesting.
It's interesting, too, because in this case, when you're talking about being a healer, you gave the number, it was like 7.8 hertz or something. They tend to get into this kind of a state. But when you think about it, the patient or the client or the person you're speaking to can also have an influence on you if you're not in a very grounded, resonant state, I would wonder. I was thinking when I read that, couldn't that go both ways?
Yes, and it's the most common question I get, Vanessa, actually, when I've been doing a lot of speaking at conferences, and people get fearful and they start to talk to me about negative energy. And I don't believe there is any such thing really as negative energy, although people can get negative, myself included. We go in and out of it. But I do think that we need to ground and fill ourselves with our own light. A lot of the protection rituals that energy healers do, I believe, come from fear a little bit and therefore a little contracting. So I prefer to do an exercise I gave in the book, which is where I ground myself. And visualizations do work on your energy field. They just do. You can direct your energy field with your mind. So I ground myself, and then I open up my crown chakra and just flood myself with my own spiritual light. And then what I do when I'm in clinic is I just push that light about an inch outside my body. That in Chinese medicine, Vanessa will remember, is called Wei Qi. It's your defensive qi. I just create a bubble of defensive qi, and that works for me. And I redo that. If I'm in clinic all day, I may do that 3 or 4 times a day. It only takes me 2 or 3 minutes. And so in between patients, I might do that. And that I have never had any problems. And I imagine it just kind of pushing off all the hooks and, little bits, vestiges of what I think of as thought forms, people's thoughts that get projected to you and become, thought forms in some way. But they're not hard to remove, I don't think. They're not, we build them up in our minds, but it's like shaking off fleas.
Yeah. And when if we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, you can see how that would be useful from the sort of larger cultural perspective too, that these thought forms become kind of contagions culturally. If there's a lot of fear and contraction and smallness, it can spread. And so the way to maybe shift that contagion is not so much to defend against, which is just more fear, but instead to remember that we can work for the light. We can be the light, and we can operate in a different way, and that starts to change the resonance. So in some ways, hugely uplifting to feel like we have some agency still, right, in this larger culture that might feel like it's going crazy sometimes, that we can do the piece from the inside out.
We have all the agency we need to affect our own worlds, in fact, and our own experience of it, which doesn't mean that things don't happen that are random and not caused by us. But we ultimately can fill ourselves back up with our own light, ground ourselves, and move forward in an empowered way. Even if you're Madhu and you break your neck, it turns out, which is a horrible thing to happen, and certainly not something that he saw ever envisaged for himself. So I think the way to navigate the bumps along the road is exactly that, not to protect yourself, but to fill yourself, and then find your next step from that place, from that very grounded, full of light place. And it becomes obvious. There is an intelligence at work that feels quite miraculous when you do that. I use it to find my keys the whole time, which is I do. I ground and I fill myself with light and I say, where are my keys? And I immediately know.
That's great. That's a good little fun, low stakes way to experiment for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And your book also had many remarkable stories that just reaffirmed for me that it's just a normal part of human potential, that there was this easefulness about it. As opposed to what fear can say, which is like, it'll be hard to fill myself with light. It'll be hard for me to know. And one of those stories was actually Bengstrom, the same mouse experiment you were talking about. But wasn't there something where the control group, which was separate and not receiving the healings, also healed, that the resonant field was that dynamic?
Yes, these resonant bonds can be turned on and off. They're very loose and they can be turned on and off. And yes, when they first started these experiments, like all good experiments, there was a control group who'd been given the cancer but didn't get the healing. And these mice were expected to die. And in the first few experiments, do you remember me saying that the mice got worse before they got better? Well, that freaked people out. The students had got attached to their mice. Bill had got attached to his mice. So in every experiment, when the mice started to look really sick, someone went to check on the control group, which is human nature, to see if they were doing as badly or if, in fact, this technique was making them worse. And the moment that they went to visit the control group, they linked them into something that's called Imans Baruch calls a healing field. He's at King's College in London, a meaning field. And so they hooked them into a meaning field. And then the control group started to heal as well, which shows that we can turn these bonds on with our minds pretty easily and sometimes inadvertently. So after that, when they realized what was going on, Bill would get the control mice and send them to a lab off-site at another college. And when they did that, the mice reliably died. The poor mice that were in the control group died because they were no longer part of a meaning field. And when I talked about placebo, I have a whole chapter on placebo, because placebos really interest me because they're very real. The placebo effect is very real, and it's another prompt to healing. The placebo effect is getting stronger, and nobody knows why. And it's got to the point where it's actually hard to test drugs because the placebo effect is getting so strong. And Bill hypothesizes that it may be that the placebo pills are getting looped into a meaning field with the real pills, and they're all ending up having the same effect. You see, it may be like the control group of mice, which is really interesting, I think. So thank you for mentioning that, because these are very loose bonds and we have to be careful what we think, it turns out.
I think it's true that most of us don't know how powerful we are. I mean, you're speaking about the power of mind, or we could call it consciousness. And in some ways, we're more powerful than we could measure, that as soon as they thought about the control mice and checked in on them, they were bringing them into this field where they could be healed. And I feel like you even mentioned that at one part when you were talking about Neale Donald Walsh, that you had to come to a place where you accepted, that healing source energy was coming through, that was important. And I think for myself personally, the more I've been able to recognize I am the light, that I can open up and that this light fills you. And it's not because you're special, it's because you're human. It's because that's your potentiality as a human. The more it frees you from fear, the more it frees you from the energy of duality and that level of consciousness. So did I hear you right when I was reading that book? Is that something that you faced in yourself, like really letting go of the doubt and knowing more about who you really are and what your potential was?
Absolutely. And I think for me, the struggle was that the thing you mentioned, actually, I was very clear I wasn't special, and that starting to think you're special ends up being a dangerous path. But so I had to tease out that I am powerful. We all are, but that doesn't necessarily make me special. And when I started to write about charlatans, which, as you know, I cover in the book, what was interesting to me is that when I thought about charlatans, I sort of thought about people who are waving their hands about and doing nothing and charging people a lot of money and just conning them. That was kind of my idea of charlatans. And I met the occasional one of those, but actually I didn't meet very many. And the vast majority of energy healers I met were profoundly talented and doing an extraordinary job with their patients and just beavering away somewhere doing that without, any kind of accolades at all. And they were humble and extraordinary. But I did meet a set of people who were exploitative. And it wasn't that they didn't have talent. They did have talent. And it wasn't that they weren't effective. They were. But they were using whatever that was to have power over other people. And I became so concerned about this, having met one too many, that I consulted a man called Dr. Thomas Gutheil, who I interviewed for the book. He's the head of psychiatry and law at Harvard. He's a forensic psychiatrist as well as a general psychiatrist. He's the founder of the Department of Psychiatry and Law at Harvard. And he is an expert on transgressions of the therapeutic relationship. He's written a lot of books and articles. He's given evidence in 300 court cases. And he said to me, be very wary of people who are a cult of one, which I thought was really interesting. He also said, and this made a lot of sense to me, he said the only thing a good practitioner should be getting from their patient is their fee and the satisfaction of having done a good job. So if someone is trying to get anything else from you, be it sex or enormous amounts of money, unreasonable amounts of money, or social influence, or, your ability to introduce them to people who can advance their career, that kind of thing, you need to be a little bit wary. And that's certainly what I learned along the way. And the problem is that these people start to believe they're special. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that they're not, that I genuinely believe this is available to all of us. And obviously some people have worked really hard. And I focused, particularly when I went to Japan, as you know, in the book, on people who were extraordinary healers with way more talent than me and way more experience than me. But the thing that made them so spectacular was that they were very humble and not remotely concerned about their own specialness. So for me, this was a journey of understanding that I am powerful in the same way that you are powerful, and that I need to use my voice to help people find their own power and find their own route through life, but that I'm not in any way special. And that's why I gave exercises. That's why I didn't write a book where I said, you have to, be initiated by me and I'm going to license out my technique. I didn't manage characterize it, because I think this is our birthright. I think this is free for all of us. And I think that problems come when you try and make it smaller.
So glad that you brought that in your book. I think that's so hugely important for the sake of, we could say, things like protecting ourselves, right? But more importantly, for the sake of bringing this beautiful capacity that we all have actually through and just making it a normal, ordinary part of human life. So it's really exciting.
Yes. That, if there's a message of my book, that would be it, that this is yours too. It's all of us. And it is a very normal part of our lives. We are connecting in ways that we do not necessarily understand, but our brain waves our heart waves are showing up in other people's brain waves. We're looping people into meaning fields. We're sending out thought forms, and just being cognizant of that puts you in choice about how you use that.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Japan, because some of your more outside the box stories came when you went to Japan and you met some pretty incredible sounding healers over there. I was curious. I mean, you even had one of them initiate you. Speaking of, not having initiations, but someone gave you a healing experience. I was curious, just in general, how is Japan for you? Like, what were your personal takeaways in sitting with these really deep, spiritually connected beings?
Well, I went to Japan for quite an extended period of time. My husband, Noah, who you know, Vanessa, came with me, and we had amazing fun. I had a wonderful time in Japan. We had an army of translators, and I had permission to ask lots of nosy questions, which made it all extraordinarily interesting and fun. And I started out, I met a man called Dr. Pepper, the improbably named Dr. Pepper, who is a phenomenal scientist at San Francisco State, Eric Pepper. And he told me that he'd done physiological testing on some healers in Japan. And he was very generous with his findings and his research to me. So I decided I would go and see two of these healers, and I would head off to Japan. But it's quite a long way to go from New York. So I asked Dr. Pepper if he would introduce me to someone who'd experienced their work, because I wanted to make sure it was worthwhile. And he introduced me to a man called Yuval Oded, who is a psychologist, a research psychologist in Israel. And Yuval told me a story that kind of blew my mind. He had had a baby that was born blind, and they, out of desperation, they had taken this baby to meet a monk called Hiroyuki Abe in Kobe, Japan. And the baby had been treated for several days and not much had happened. And I think they were starting to get a bit dispirited. And then they wheeled him out and he screwed up his eyes and they realized that he could see the light. And when I talked to Yuval, the little boy is 4 and could still see. And so with that, I decided that I would go and find Hiroyuki Abe, and I set off on a flight to Osaka and went to Kobe to find him. And he was an extraordinary figure. And for quite a while, he didn't trust me. He kept saying, "We need to be friends before I will talk to you about what I do." So I was in the fun position of just being Hiroyuki Abe's friends. He was very gregarious and much more of a party animal than me. And we got on trains and off trains. We went to Kyoto. My husband kept saying, "When do we find the what he's doing?" And I was like, "I don't know. I'm just trying to be his friend." He was surrounded by people at all times. He had students, and it was a whole thing. But eventually he let me watch him work, and he was profoundly talented. And Dr. Pepper said something very interesting to me. He said the reason he's so effective is because patients feel completely safe in his presence. And I witnessed that. And I realized that people do need to feel safe in order to heal, that in order to unpack and unravel and reorganize your energy field, you have to feel safe. And I think I've always instinctively known that. Unova, I was always very careful that we kept our clinic very safe. And I have removed people who I considered unsafe or, disrespectful of the patients for that reason. And we hold people in a great deal of love and esteem, our patients. And I've always understood that was important. But Dr. Pepper explained to me that the mirror neurons that the patients use in order to create the same frequency so that their heart, remember, my patients' hearts go into resonance with mine. Well, to do that, they need to feel safe because they then start to mirror your state. And that's how we connect at the same frequency. So Hiroyuki Abe was creating an extraordinary sense of safety in the clinic. You could tell him anything. And I realized that some of his gregariousness was also about that. He wasn't a sort of holier than thou monk. He was a have a drink kind of monk and let's go out for shabu shabu kind of monk. And you're right, Vanessa, right at the end of the book, I revisit Hiroyuki Abe because he offered to open my chakras. And I, as a Westerner, took it way too lightly. I was like, sure, you can open my chakras. His students gasped because he never makes this offer at all. And I have video of it, which when we see each other, I'll show you guys. But I shut my eyes and there was lots of pulling and I could feel him in my body actually. And it felt very peculiar. And I began to realize that this was a bigger deal than I had thought. And I was like, whoa. But when I opened my eyes, I never saw the world the same again. Wow. I was in a room full of his students who I'd spent several days with, lovely people. And suddenly all I could see was their light. It was like they were shining and there was just light everywhere. And I started to see the movement rather than the matter, and I started to see the light and how beautiful we are and how that light connects us. And I went back a little bit. I stopped seeing everybody, just as light, which is good because that would have been a bit much. But I never saw people the same way again. I saw our sort of intrinsic beauty, and that beauty comes from movement and vibration. And that movement and vibration is possibility. Endless possibility for change and recreation and regeneration. And what Neale Donald Walsh would say, creating the next grandest version of yourself. It's all in that movement. And that's where we affect each other. So I also saw another very extraordinary healer in Japan, but I'll leave you to read about him in the book. He put skewers through his tongue.
I got like the chills just reading that part. I'm like, oh,
it must have been
impressive, yes. But wow.
Yeah, he's in his 80s and he was profoundly talented. And what he was able to do, he's a yogi. He had been Mr. Japan in 1979, which I love.
I love that fact. That's so funny.
love. And then he started to work on his insides. And he was a profoundly talented, disciplined yogi. And he was able to expand his consciousness outside his body at will. It made him extraordinarily psychic. But he would heal from that place. And he was doing it with the breath. I give breathing exercises in the book, although to become a master like Master Kawakami takes, I believe, a lifetime of very disciplined work. And in his 80s, he's still an extraordinarily disciplined man. He's getting up at 4 to meditate and he's very centered. He's also, though, someone who makes you feel completely safe. He is someone, he's a very kind man. And if you think back to when we were talking about charlatans or people who are exploitative, it's hard to heal from that place where you're exploiting people. One of the things that I really saw was that good healers don't let themselves go to that place, although it's tempting, because the healing happens when the patient is genuinely safe rather than being conned into thinking they're safe. And that's when information gets transferred from one person to another.
That makes complete sense from my experience. In a way, I like that you're demystifying what's mystical. And I like listening to you talk about it too, because I'm getting this same feeling. Sometimes if you talk about the spiritual path or the mystical path, the connotation is it's something outside of this, right? Outside of three women sitting and talking over a computer, but it's not actually outside of anything. And I like that you brought in that different cultures may have different rituals or different visuals. They may picture, one of the healers pictures a goddess coming through, and another one. I've met a Native American healer who he said, I don't know what happens to me, but my hand becomes an eagle and I heal people. And, I'd read Buddhist texts, and when they would describe the other realms, the heaven and hell realms, I would say, well, they never mentioned seeing a white person or a black person, which would be shocking back then because they weren't traveling, right? It clearly can't be all in all the truth with the capital T. But I like that you brought in how culture plays through this body to bring understanding to something that it's experiencing. Did I paraphrase you well enough to capture it? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I always describe it in terms of computing in some ways. We create little avatars in order to understand something that is much bigger than that. And those are based on our cultural experience. So I talked to Catholic healers who see angels. I met people who saw Kuan Yin. I met people who saw nothing at all, which is me. And you're right, Hiroyuki Abe sees a goddess, the goddess of mercy. And one of the things that I love about his story is when I was interviewing him, I said, when did you first see the goddess? Yeah. Have you always seen the goddess? Which is an interesting question. And he said, well, no, I haven't always seen her. I had got a divorce. I married young and I got a divorce and I traveled home to tell my mother. And I just suddenly saw her in the corner. And I said, did you tell your mother you could see a goddess? And he said, oh, no, I'd already given her too much bad news, which I thought was really sweet. Oh, and by the way, I'm also seeing a goddess now. And then he said, I thought this was really funny. He said, well, she stayed with me from then on and she taught me to heal. And she was very bossy and old school. And I got very frustrated with her, which I thought was funny because she was the goddess of mercy. But he said, she was really hard on me and she just drove me really hard to learn how to heal. Now, does Hiroyuki Abe see the goddess of mercy? I don't know, is the answer to that question. I don't know. But I suspect we're all seeing the same thing, which is an intelligence, which is spiritual intelligence. And we anthropomorphize that intelligence because it's too hard for us to understand. I don't imagine God is a white man with a beard sitting on a cloud, wagging his finger, really. But how hard is it to conceive of God as just light and intelligence and a sort of pulsation, a vibration? It's really hard. And so we make God smaller, I think, and in our image, and we make goddesses in this case, or eagles, or, and I think of them all as avatars, as stand-ins for the larger energy field, which the Chinese actually called the Tao, which is the most, in some ways, the most expansive version of that God, just nothingness from which arises duality, yin and yang, and, the ripples in the Tao that our thoughts and our feelings and our intentions create, that then create more yin and yang, more duality. I think Taoism is always a hard concept for people because there isn't a person to worship. But I suspect it's nearer to the truth, which is that we are from a vast energy field of intelligence, and every thought we think, every feeling we have causes a ripple in that field that affects ourselves and other people, and creates the next step in our path. So that was rather a long answer to your question.
No, it's a great answer.
Wonderful.
But that's what I saw. I saw a vast variety of different explanations for the same thing, really.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful that you got to take us along on this adventure with you. The book was beautiful. And thank you for bringing all of this through. I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to, you had so many adventures. If it's tempting to want to cram them all in conversation, but of course we can't. It was this amazing, expansive story.
Read the book,
but if there's anything that, really wants to come forward still, I would love to hear that, of course.
I think we covered it, actually. I never prepare for these interviews because I feel like this book wrote me. I did not write this book. It came through me. And then when I talk to people like yourselves, what's supposed to come through comes through. And I feel like the message of this is our connection and our oneness that comes from our oneness, and how profoundly healing that connection can be, and also profoundly destructive if we allow ourselves to contract with fear. So I would love people to read this book, not just because I wrote it, but because I had an enormously fun journey writing it, which I think comes across in the book. Sure and I think it explains us to us. I think there are a lot of people out there with healing energy. There are Reiki practitioners, and I cover Reiki in the book, and acupuncturists, and all sorts of people who are finding that this book explains them to them. And yesterday, I happened to be in my practice, Unova, which I'm not normally. It was a Sunday, I'm not normally. And there was a patient there who was an emergency room doc, and he told me, "Oh, this book explained me to me." And I realized that doctors are also having intense connections with patients, healing connections, healing conversations, and are also struck by the mystery of why some people heal and why others don't. And this book is speaking to them, particularly because there's a sort of scientific explanation for much of it, which I think is helpful. So I would love you to read this book. And thank you, Vanessa and Brooke, for reading it so closely and for having me on your show.
I think I finished it in 2 days.
It was a quick, fun read for sure.
Yeah, but deep and full of information. You did a really good job of integrating right and left brain here so that it is palatable. I mean, we are thoughtful people. I think a lot of people who are empathic as well tend to be humble. And they want to question their beliefs, right, to ensure that they're coming across in integrity. So you gave food for sort of all parts of a human experience, the left brain that wants to understand why, and the right brain that wants to just open up and expand and be one. And I think it was wonderful. And I think it's going to be really fun to see what happens for you next, now that this book is over.
Yes. Well, I'm already thinking about my next book. So that I am. I'm actually starting to think about the ramifications of that oneness and going a little bit deeper into what that means practically for us as human beings on this journey. So I am going to carry on, I think. And Unova is expanding. And I work with a team of phenomenal people, absolutely phenomenal. And I have really got it that openness, and that if you open to source energy and you step forward in alignment with that intelligence, extraordinary things happen. Special people come into your life, and the next step just opens up in front of you. So I'm about to step into that next step.
Oh, well, howdy. Can't wait.
We are excited.
A great place to wrap up. And thank you so much for being with us, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. This is where you can go help support us by donating to the show. You can also come play with us on Instagram and Facebook, or subscribe on the website to get a weekly digest of what resources we are currently loving. We're so grateful for the reviews so many of you have written, for the membership support so many of you have provided, and for all the notes and comments you share with us. I want to share one review from Stephen Mace, who says, "Thanks to Brooke and Vanessa for a great podcast. Just started listening recently, and each episode has given me some, whoa, I need to think about that moments. Funny, playful, real, and insightful. Love it." Thank you, Stephen. And thank you all so much for joining us. Till next week.